So want to start just high level in why specs inserts matter. And then so that's that first bullet point. And then the rest of these here will actually flip over into Steelhead and walk through what does the dynamic management look like? What does the data collection aspect and putting that on certifications? What is the structure? What is everything related to certs and specs in Steelhead here? So really quick, in general, why do certs and specs matter? Well, first of all, it is a framework or that roadmap to meet and exceed those industry standards to ensure that the quality of our services, the quality of the product that we're outputting is meeting those standards as set by the industry. It also specs also force compliance from our team in terms of meeting or production, but then also the environmental compliance factor and things like that. Specs and certs, they also provide competence in the specific industries that we're in, whether it's plating or powder coating or thermal spray, whatever it might be. Your customers' customers, they can gain confidence in the services that you're providing because they understand that these specs, they're constantly evolving, they're always being looked at, they're being studied. So just providing that confidence to them in the work that we're doing, regardless of the industry that we work in. Lastly, in general, from a health and safety perspective, so not only in our workplace, but also they drive health and safety with the products that we're finishing and the end users of those products. So why do they matter to OEMs or your customers or your customers' customers? Well, first of all, it allows for them to have some consistency in their supply chain. So they don't have a single vendor or single supplier for the services that you are providing. They have multiple people doing that work for them. So they need that consistency from vendor A to vendor B to vendor C. They also care, obviously, about the traceability. If there's any quality issues or any concerns that they need to track down, they have to have that record of what was done to these parts, who touched them, and when. Obviously, the granularity there depends on the industries that you are servicing. Confirmation of the work that's been done. So just a stamp of approval to say, hey, we confirm that we did this work and this is how we processed it. This is what we collected regarding that job. And then the confidence in the quality of the work that you are producing. Lastly, from your perspective, why do specs inserts matter to metal finishers, to job shops? First of all, just that consistent first time through quality. So ensuring that our team is processing the parts to that specification each and every time, again, to meet those industry standards, that roadmap or that framework. Direction, guidance, and force compliance. So this is just ensuring that the operators that we're hiring are indeed processing those parts to the quality or level quality that we would expect. The specs inserts do open up an opportunity or provide an opportunity for higher margin work. So obviously, the more intense the data collection that we need to do, the more information that we have to document regarding the processing of these parts. Well, that takes time, and that's what we can charge for. We can charge for the certifications of that work. And then lastly, just risk mitigation and rework reduction. So again, goes back to that first time through quality. If we can put in a robust process in place that meets a specification that's been studied, well, we reduce the risk of that rework in those events. So just a high level overview of, okay, why in general do specs inserts matter? I am going to flip over now to Steelhead itself and walk through start to finish what that looks like. And as mentioned, throw questions in the chat at any point in time. I'll try and monitor that, or we'll get to those questions at the end. All right, so we should be seeing Steelhead here. And we'll start at the highest level in terms of like dynamic spec management. So in Steelhead, under your configuration area, you'll have a spec tile. So in the spec tile, this is where all of our specs reside. I'm going to filter to ones that I set up for this specific class. But these specs can range from, and they're driven by different things, right? We might have an industry specification. We might have a manufacturer spec from the coding that we're applying. We might have our own proprietary spec that links all of these different specs together to ensure that, hey, this is how we want to process these parts. Again, another manufacturer spec, but maybe from a cleaning perspective or a chemical provider. And then lastly, an internal quality data check specification. So information that maybe our customers aren't requiring that we collect, but data from production that we care to collect to trend over time and look at that sort of thing. First thing you'll see is the ability to mark these specs as internal and external. And I will start by just creating a new spec and see what that looks like. So when I create a new spec here, let's say 4.0, quality data check spec 2. I have the ability to apply some revisions here so we can start tracking that. Let's say this is an internal spec and then a description of what this spec might be. So I've now created this new specification. And when I click into this specification to start flushing this out or building it out, the first thing that you'll see is spec fields. So a spec field, a good description here would be, it really entails two things. The first is if we're reading an industry spec and we pull pertinent pieces of data from that, because as a job shop, we're responsible for reading that specification and identifying these are the areas that I care to process to. Anodizing is a good example. In the MIL A8625 spec, you have to pull out, okay, what is our class? What is our type? So that would be one type of spec field. The other type of spec field is data that we care to collect from that production process. So that's what a spec field is. If I just pick one that we've established already, it might be like a mil thickness. So a piece of data that we care to collect. Generic versus not generic. This just allows us to update it on the spec level or update if we check generic, that means we can update it on the spec level. If it's not a generic spec, well, then it's updated and maintained on each individual area or location where this spec is managed, the spec field. So drilling down into the spec fields, so we have a mil thickness as our spec field. And then when I go into this pertinent spec field, this is where I can start defining the pieces of data that I want to collect regarding this spec field. So that's what a parameter is. So we might have a couple different parameters here. Maybe we want to check from like 0.5 to 1. And then we'll populate that field a little bit more, but then we want to go from like 1 to 1.5. So then when we're referencing these specifications on a part number, on a treatment, we have the ability to select, okay, we want to be in this bucket or we want to be in this bucket. When we look at defining these spec fields a little bit more, so I click my pencil here and I have this dialog. So what this means is just different options for our team to interact with these various spec fields. Input required, this simply means that, hey, my operator needs to give me information wherever this spec field is linked. Input requested is just a prompt to say, hey, there is a request for information here, but it's not required for this part to move forward. Must be passing. So this means that if we don't meet the threshold, whatever that measurement might be, then again, it's a stop gate. We can't move these parts forward. Requesting a document, this just simply is a prompt for if we collect a measurement, well, we have a dialog pop up to take a picture of a sensor or to attach a file from a printer or output or PDF, whatever it might be, but just supporting documentation regarding this piece of information that we're collecting. And then we have a whole bunch of options in terms of how often or how many of these measurements do we need to meet or collect. And then depending on the spec field type, you'll have some different options for data collection here. So going back to the spec field types, because I do realize I skipped over that. So let's go back into this specification. And when we create a new spec field, so that mil thickness one that I selected was a number. So you have a lot of flexibility in terms of what sort of information are we requiring or do we want to display regarding this spec field. So that varies from a number to a Boolean, a date and a time, just simple text field, a timer, or we can pull in sensor readings. So this you have a ton of flexibility here in terms of setting up the different pieces of data or information that we want to collect or give to our team. So in general, that's the very high level of building a spec with the spec fields and with the parameters in Steelhead. So how does that integrate into production? So when we look at a spec parameter here in a spec field, if it's a piece of data that we want to collect from our team, well, we have to tell our team when we want to collect that data. So when I go back into configuration and look into one of my processes, say metal finishing here, this is my parent process tree. This is that routing that our deployment engineers are setting up for the work flowing through your plant. But at this point, then quality checks, say we want to collect certain information here. I can scroll down or clean. Maybe I had some. I can scroll down to my spec fields section, and this is where we're putting in the piece of information that we care to collect or to display to our team. Process, again, oven temperature, oven time. So two pieces of information that we're collecting from our team that have a different type here. So that's that link to production. When we create the specification, when we pull out the pertinent pieces of data that we care about, and we define the pieces of information that we want to collect or that we want to give to our team, then we assign this is where we want that information to display. If I go back into specs, just want to make sure that I've covered everything here before we get into what does it actually look like. Okay, yep. So one more thing, there is the ability, like if we can envision this proprietary spec. So this might be something that we determine or develop internally, and then that's like the master. So if I look at my proprietary spec for 4.0 finishers here, this specification is pulling in related specifications. So we've built this parent or this master spec based off of everything that we know from an industry spec, from a manufacturer spec, and also from an internal specification in terms of the quality data that we care to collect. So this is what we call specs on specs. It's building out those spec assemblies or linking all of those pieces of information together. And this is extremely powerful in terms of the management, the dynamic management of specifications and how everything is related. It's not often that you're processing just to one specification. It's quite often that you're processing to a specification that's linked to another one, that's linked to another one. And that's how that chain is built out here in Steelhead. You'll also see the ability to tie these to specific processes. So when I build out a specification, I can assign that specification to a default process. And we'll get into this in a minute, but this, if from an order entry perspective or from a part planning perspective, we can pick that parent specification, and then that will build out that process tree based off of these selections that we have set up on the back end. And that includes like opting in and opting out of steps. So you'll see that step 3 and step 4. We either go to one of these, step 3 or step 4. And from a spec perspective, that's being driven by my selection here. So special step needed. If I go in here, I can see, okay, I have 2 parameters, step 3 and step 4. And when I go into this a little bit further, step 3, this is what's specifying an opt in to step 3. So when I assign this specification, I pick either step 3 or step 4 for that specific spec parameter. And then that also factors into my process flow for these parts. So switching gears into production and what that looks like. Not seeing questions in the chat, so that's good. So if I'm going to enter an order, and let's say my customer is ABC MFG, I'm going to save and add some parts here. And if I've run this part before, like this MC123-R2, we can see that, okay, here are the specs that we have set for this part number. And we can also see that, okay, my process is being derived from that specification. This cleaning treatment is being derived from that part number. If I come in here and add a new part number, so let's say new part number, and this can be done at the time of quoting as well, this same process flow. So I can enter in as much or as little information as I need, but for the purposes of today and specifications, I've created that new part number profile. Now I'm going to set a spec. So I can come in here and find my proprietary specification Rev2. This is where that special step needed. This is where okay, for this part number, let's opt in to step 3. And then here is where that specs on specs, those links are being pulled in. So we have the option to say, okay, no, we don't want to attach this industry spec, or yes, we do. I click save, and now I have the ability to drill down into each of those specifications to build out the parameters that are needed. So like this one here, parameter not set. Okay, let's set that parameter. Cleaning method, method 3. Click save here and finish this up. Now this is what builds out my process flow for these parts. And then I can select an option here for the coding. Say I have 15 of these, 15 of these, click save. Now I've kicked that job into production. So from there, actually, before we get into production, I want to show what it looks like to supersede and to revise these specifications. So when we go back into specs here, I have my proprietary spec for 4.0 finishers, and that is Rev 2 here. And I've revised that to go to Rev 3 for that specification. And in that revision, then we would make whatever changes are required per the spec being revised, or why we're going through that effort. And then at that point, we would say, okay, we want to 4.0 finishers, we want to supersede our old spec, this revision number 2, with our new spec, revision number 3. So first of all, we can see, okay, this spec has been revised. Here's that new revision. I'm going to supersede or replace this specification with Rev 3 of the same specification with the changes that we've made. So now I have my Rev 2, which is a revision of Rev 1. It's superseded by Rev 3, but it also supersedes Rev 1. So we have that traceability, that history there. So now when I go back into an order, let's say I'm going to add some of these parts for my customer, and this MC123R2, now I get a warning here that says, hey, this part number has a superseded spec. So Rev 2 has been superseded by Rev 3. We recommend that you create a copy of this part number and replace it. So when I click copy and replace here, let's say now, okay, this is going to be for Rev 3. Next, here's the specs that we've added by supersession with the parameters so that we can update these. Click next and save. Now I have a new part number that's linked to the new specification. The reason that we have the copied part numbers there is we might have some of those Rev 2 part numbers following spec 2, Rev 2, that are currently working their way through the production process. We also have the traceability. So like in a year from now, if we can compare and see, okay, from a quality perspective, what was the change from Rev 2 to Rev 3 on our quality of this part? You have that direct traceability because those part numbers are linked to those pertinent spec revisions. So let's go back into production. So what does it look like then once we have our spec set, once we have the data collection the way that we want it, and how that looks from a production standpoint. So in our workboards here, here's my parts that are in clean. As I'm moving these through, we'll be prompted for inputs from the production process. So here I'm prompted, okay, I have a couple inputs on this part number for this specific step. So it might be like an oven temperature, say 600 degrees Fahrenheit that these parts were processed. And then maybe we want to time how long these parts are in that oven. So the data that I record here, this then is saved to that part number, to this job, to this customer, so that we can always go back and find that information. There's that digital trail, that link. I'm going to stop this timer here and then move these parts into the next step of the process that we've determined, step 4. Again, I have a couple different options here to collect information from production. Lastly, we'll move these into a quality check, and we do have the ability to set like a quality assurance node type for this step in the process. So what this looks like is it's a little bit different, and all it's taking is the data that we've collected from that production process so far and putting that in one central hub or one area to look at. So here's my part number, and here's the different specs that we applied to this part number. And here's the data that we collected from the production process for this job. And again, all of this information then can be passed through into a certification. So what that looks like, if I look at one of my work orders, and certs can be generated at any point in the process. But when I look at my work order, here's my spec results. So that same window, just in a different area, and I create my cert. Now I'm pulling in that information from that production process into a certification that I'm generating. So here, the certs that we have, you can have multiple templates here depending on the customer, depending on the level or granularity of data that I want to put on here. But for this purpose, let's put all of our production data onto this certification. Did I not collect any for this job? Metal finishing, let's go here. Okay, so I have some data on work order 925, and let's generate the cert for this one here. Create cert. You could have the ability to filter between the internal and external specifications that we've assigned and pulled into this job, these parts. My NADCAP template. Master cert would combine these parts onto one certification. And there's that information being pulled into the pertinent fields. So again, custom PDF templates for as many different certs that we want to issue to our customers. I save this. I have the ability to put in some comments, cert statements. If we did collect any documents, say pictures of a sensor or supporting printouts from a printer, those would be available here to attach to our certifications. Finish this up, and then we can digitally sign these certs and get those sent out to your customers. They'll also have the ability to access these certifications from their customer portal. So here's my work order, certifications that are linked to it. Let's just look at one of these, and we can send these out from Steelhead here. There's a couple different avenues for us to send out these certifications. It can be done from here. It can be done from the shipping screen. They can also be derived there or built there. A lot of optionality in terms of when do we want to generate these and when do we want to send them out. See a question in the chat, saved signature for certs. Yes, I believe that if it's not possible, we can in some areas, or we've had some customers that have just built that in as part of the template itself. So it's always in there. Send this out to my customer. And then let's actually access that from their customer portal and see what that looks like. So I go into my portal for ABC, MFG, certifications. Here is that cert that we just sent out to them. So they'll have the ability to come in here and pull that themselves. Giancarlo feature to auto send 100% of certs. We are working on automating that process. There will be some sort of a confirmation that's needed, but yes, there will be some automation there that's coming. From a specification, certification, the spec setup, the spec management, the collecting data, generating those certifications, I'd say that's fairly comprehensive of the functionality there in Steelhead, and open, I guess, now for any questions that we might have.